The first thing I see in my sleep, even now, is a strip of sun-faded cloth wedged in stone, just a whisper of blue caught between two sandstone shoulders high above a dry chute. Wind moves it an inch, maybe less, and the canyon takes a breath that sounds like a long, low sigh. No birds, no voices. Just that cloth stubborn in the crack where it should never have been. Drop your city in the comments and subscribe if stories like this remind you how quickly peace can disappear. I've worked this rim long enough to know when the canyon is in a forgiving mood. Early fall is good for that cool mornings in the low 50s air, so clean it feels newly minted. The store at Desert View opens quiet coffee steaming up a plate glass window. Cameras click and boots scuff the stone where a CCC crew set blocks almost a century ago. That Tuesday September sun climbed slow and calm, laying gold across the watchtower and pulling purple out of the far palisades. The place looked honest. It always does right up to the second it doesn't. I start my rounds with a thermos and a checklist. That's my rhythm. Check the overlook rails, scan the SkyNote wind from the west 5 to 8 miles per hour. I log the forecast in pencil because I trust paper more than cell towers on the rim. Pleasant today, possible storms rolling in tomorrow afternoon. At 8:47 a.m., my radio squawked as the gate camera time-stamped an older Toyota 4Runner easing through paint sun-softened tires, still throwing a little dust from the park road. I didn't know the two inside yet. I would about half an hour later. Flagstaff has its own rhythm. Every fall, kids back at school, the college slow to wake after Labor Day, crowds thin out. I drive in from the east side most mornings, past a gas station that still sells hand-drawn maps, past a diner that doesn't pretend to be anything it isn't. Some days, if I'm off the rim, I'll see Mrs. Patterson out front of the apartments on Butler Avenue, leaning on the rail and watering a little square of flowers she keeps alive by force of will. A week before that Tuesday, she mentioned her favorite neighbor was taking her granddaughter out to see the quiet places. She asked if I'd be around. Folks do that just wanting to say a name out loud to somebody who will listen. I told her I'd be on duty. By mid-morning, the canyon had that rung bell clarity you only get after a cool night. Shadows set like ink in the folds below Desert View, and the watchtower stones held the last of the night's chill. I was at the southeast wall, running a finger along a hairline crack I monitor each month when two hikers spread a map where the rock is level enough to work. The older woman had that posture I recognize: soft shoulders, strong legs, boots that have earned their scuffs. The younger one felt the straps of her pack and rolled her shoulders as if to memorize the weight. I stepped over, not to police them, just to do what we do out here. Have a word, learn a plan, make sure we'd recognize their footprints if we needed to. Beautiful morning to get lost in the view, I said. The older woman smiled, with her whole face crow's feet deepening in a way that read as kindness, not years. She introduced herself as Margaret and the young woman as Emma. Their map was already creased exactly where I would have folded it: Desert View across the top, the Tanner Trail ribboning away, and a finger smudge set toward a drainage that doesn't see many day hikers. She was proud of that map. I can tell when a person knows their ground. Her notes were neat pencil gray windproof. Emma touched the route with a fingertip as though it was a story she already loved. They had water and the right boots. They carried a small satellite communicator clipped high on the belt, where a hand can find it in the dark. Margaret tapped it and told me matter of fact that her daughter expected a check-in around sunset, 6:15 p.m. She said, like a nurse saying, "Take this with food." I nodded and circled the forecast again, a habit more than a warning. Fair today, I told them. Tomorrow could change its mind late in the afternoon. Emma lifted her camera and took a test shot of the tower bricks, the kind of frame a person makes to learn how color behaves in new light. I checked the time, 9:15 a.m., and logged their general direction, not because they seemed careless, but because I collect puzzle pieces before I know I'll need the box top. The watchtower has a smell I can't ever quite describe, sun-warmed mortar old pine, a little dust that tastes like iron if you stand in the doorway too long. We talked maybe 2 minutes more. Water sources, cell dead zones, the way the canyon likes to hide sound and bend your sense of distance. Margaret had that quiet confidence that comes from both miles and mistakes, survived. Emma carried a kind of tuned-up alertness I see in students who've just finished something hard and want to test their new edges against the real world. When they shouldered their packs and drifted east along the rim, they moved like a pair who know how to match strides without talking about it. The day rolled on the way good days do. A couple from Ohio asked about condors. A school group took a long time untangling a knot of water bottles from a bag that never should have held that many water bottles. At 11:40, I logged a dust devil crossing the flats south of the river, a skinny column trembling like a rope. When I can, I walk the first quarter mile of the Tanner just to listen. The sound changes out there. Wind grows a second voice, one that comes from below your feet. I saw boot prints that read like clean handwriting. Deep heel, brisk pace, not dragging. I didn't measure them then. No one was missing. The canyon was merely itself. Out east, the land opens and closes like a book being thumbed. Mesquite grabs your cuffs if you let it. The sun warms the rock to the high 60s by lunch, and if you rest on a ledge long enough, you can feel your pulse settle to match the shade. I ate half a ham sandwich and watched light work the cliffs like slow magic. A maintenance truck rumbled along a service spur behind me. I waved to Roberto, who was headed to clear a drain that always clogs after summer monsoons. We all have our loops. His is that drain. Mine is a circuit of railings and trailheads and faces I try to remember long after they pass. Flagstaff sits under its own sky, high and blue and well-behaved in September. On days when I finish late, I'll cut through town past the library and the courthouse lawn, where a bronze soldier faces down a sentry and the wind plays the same two songs in the pines. I've seen Margaret there on Sundays, not often rolling a grocery cart back across the lot to save the next driver a step. She was the kind of person who doesn't call attention to herself, but never blends into the scenery either. There's a steadiness you can spot across a parking lot if you've been watching people this long. By mid-afternoon, the canyon warmed to 72. Tour buses sighed in and out like whales breathing at the surface. A volunteer at the information desk teased me for still using a paper log. I tapped the cover and told him paper has never run out of bars. He rolled his eyes and I checked the horizon again. Weather's a long story out here, and fall storms will lay their groundwork in the thin lines of cloud no one else bothers to see. I could tell tomorrow might build something messy after lunch. Nothing urgent. Not yet. Late in the day, the light softens and color floods the cliffs in a way that feels almost private, like church after everyone has gone home. I was finishing my second walk through at Desert View, listening to the watchtower staircase creak under a family headed down when I thought of that little satellite communicator riding high on a belt somewhere below the rim. People joke that I'm superstitious about those check-in times. It's not superstition. It's routine. Routine keeps folks honest with themselves out here. A time set is a time met, or there's a reason. Sarah Rodriguez had called the station earlier that month to ask about good practice for check-ins with a parent on the trail. We spoke for 5 minutes. I told her the same thing I tell anyone who asks: agree on a time that allows for a late lunch, a photograph, a blister break. Pad it an hour to be kind. If the message doesn't come, don't panic, but don't roll over and sleep on it either. Write the plan down and tape it to the refrigerator next to the calendar. She laughed and said her mom would pretend not to need the rules and follow every single one anyway. Sunset comes quick at the rim, like someone reached up and pulled a chain on the sky. The visitors stood shoulder to shoulder along the guardrail, faces turned west, phones held high, and for 2 minutes, no one spoke. The Colorado shone like a thread caught in the last of the light, then dark swallowed it, and the evening chilled 10 degrees the way it always does. I made my final notes. Temps dropping toward the low 50s by midnight. Winds, steady, parking lots thinning. One coyote seen loping the tree line near the service road. I clicked my pen shut and stood still long enough to hear the canyon settle. Back in town, porch lights blink on in ones and twos across apartment balconies. Mrs. Patterson keeps hers a soft amber all year and sits behind the curtain with a crossword. She told me once she leaves that light on when her girls are out just for luck. On the rim, the after-hours quiet takes on a shape you can lean against gravel under your boots, a rustle in the junipers, the radio low at your hip. Somewhere below, boot soles meet stone and a camera lens looks for one last frame in the violet hour. At 6:15 p.m., a satellite somewhere over New Mexico passes overhead. It takes half a second for a message to ride that roadless sky and land in a daughter's phone in Phoenix. Half a second is nothing. Half a second is everything. The tower light clicks over to night mode and the ranger station windows show me my own reflection. Somewhere, a kitchen clock in Flagstaff ticks through a quiet dinner for one. A notepad near a refrigerator magnet reads a time in neat handwriting, and the rim, faithful as always, holds its breath just a little longer than it should. By 8 o'clock, the overlook was nearly empty, the last set of headlights turning away from desert view and dropping toward the highway. The wind slid along the stone with that dry, papery sound it gets in fall, and the watchtower stood dark as a sentinel. I locked the door, listened once more to the radio, and glanced toward the eastern sky out of habit. Somewhere back in town, a single porch light burned on steady and patient, waiting for footsteps that hadn't yet climbed the stairs. By the time the sun slipped behind the rim that night, the wind had taken on that hollow sound. The canyon gets after dark, like it's whispering down through its own bones. I was back at the ranger station logging the last of the day's notes when the phone rang. It was one of the dispatch operators, voice low and steady, asking if I'd spoken to a pair of hikers named Margaret Chen and Emma Rodriguez earlier that morning. I said I had around 9:15. She told me their daughter and mother Sarah Rodriguez had called in. No check-in message had come through on their satellite communicator. I looked at the clock, 9:32 p.m. I remember that detail because I wrote it down on the corner of my pad thinking maybe it would anchor the moment to something solid. Out here, small times mean a lot. I told dispatch I'd drive back out toward Desert View just in case they'd returned late. The park at night is a world of its own. Empty parking lots, wind scraping sand across asphalt, the smell of juniper and stone cooling fast. I pulled in headlights cutting across the overlook. Nothing. No vehicles except a single maintenance truck parked near the water station. The air was 52 degrees clear, no moonlight yet. I radioed back that their forerunner wasn't there, then walked to the rail and looked out. The canyon was all shadow, a void swallowing its own sound. You can yell your name out there at night and get nothing back, not even an echo. Protocol says you give it until morning, but experience says you start thinking now. Margaret wasn't a casual tourist. She carried herself like someone who respected distance, someone who knew that time in the canyon moves differently. Missing a check-in wasn't her style. I went home, couldn't sleep, and by 5 a.m. I was already back on the rim when the search call came through officially. At sunrise, the sky went pale gold over the watchtower. The incident commander that morning was Lisa Rodriguez, no relation to the family. She's one of those steady people who can hold a room without raising her voice. We set up a base at Desert View tables, maps, radios, the usual spread. Volunteers began filtering in other rangers, local hiking clubs, a few folks who'd heard the news on early radio and just wanted to help. We divided the grid starting from the Tanner trailhead where I'd last seen them. My assignment was the first 3 miles, retracing their likely route. The first hours of a search are a strange mix of hope and calculation. You start with simple logic. 2 hikers experienced carrying water daylight on their side. Maybe they took a wrong junction or stopped to wait out a shortfall of energy. But the canyon changes all that. The light shifts, shadows play tricks, distances stretch. What looks like a half mile can be 3. I walked the path slowly, eyes scanning for boot prints or scuffed soil. By mid-morning, heat was already rising off the rock, turning the air sharp with that mineral scent that smells a little like rain even when the sky's empty. Around 10, one of the ground teams called in find a blue hat caught in a manzanita bush about 50 yards off the main trail. I hiked over and saw it for myself. The brim was still stiff, not sun-bleached, which meant it hadn't been there long. But it wasn't lying in the dirt like a dropped thing. It was hanging neatly at eye level. My gut tightened. I've seen accidents, and I've seen signals, and this looked more like the latter. Someone had wanted it to be seen. I marked the coordinates and radioed them back. That spot became our new center. The following hours blurred into a kind of motion without distance, boots crunching gravel, radios crackling with half-heard call signs, the helicopter thumping low overhead. Every few minutes, someone shouted a name into the canyon. The sound disappeared before it could find its echo. By noon, I met up with Sarah Rodriguez. She'd driven through the night from Phoenix, eyes red, hands clutching a notebook full of her mother's roots and notes. She looked at me like I might know something she didn't. I told her the truth, we were doing everything we could. She nodded once and stared out at the horizon. You could see her trying to measure how big the word everything really was. By late afternoon, a second clue surfaced: a silver water bottle wedged between 2 rocks in a shallow ravine about half a mile east of the hat. It still had water inside. That stopped me cold. People in trouble drink even sparingly. Leaving a nearly full bottle doesn't fit. I picked it up with gloved hands, felt the condensation still inside from temperature changes, then set it back exactly where it was found. I wanted the investigators to see it untouched. From that moment on, the air felt heavier. Helicopters circled into the evening, their blades dragging shadows across the cliffs. We watched from the command post as the searchlights crawled the canyon walls, tracing patterns like restless ghosts. Reporters began arriving before sunset, drawn by the story a grandmother and granddaughter, both experienced hikers, vanishing inside one of America's most mapped parks. The irony didn't escape any of us. You can trace every footpath on a screen, yet still lose 2 people in plain daylight. The second night was the worst. The families set up in the Desert View Lodge, waiting for news that wouldn't come. Every door creak, every radio chirp, you could see their heads lift. At midnight, the weather shifted, thin clouds rolling in wind carrying the smell of distant rain. I stood outside the command tent and looked into the dark, thinking about that little blue hat, how deliberate it had looked. Sometimes the canyon doesn't take. Sometimes it hides. The next morning came bright and cloudless, the kind of beauty that almost feels cruel. More volunteers arrived, college students, retirees, old trail hands. We sent teams deeper into the drainages and side gullies that feed into Palisades Creek. It's hard country down there. Loose shale, scrub pine, narrow cuts where the sun never touches the ground. You learn quickly that sound and sight aren't your allies. A call can bend around a wall of rock and vanish. Around noon, I joined a crew rappelling into a small canyon mouth about 2 miles from the trail. Dust rose in slow spirals where our rope slid. At the bottom, we found a fire ring, cold ashes, 2 foil wrappers, and a bit of paracord cut clean through. It was too neat to be old. My throat went dry. The wrappers matched the brand listed on their gear checklist. For a moment, hope flared. They'd camped, maybe waited out a sprain, maybe moved on when weather cleared. But there was no sign of struggle, no note, no footprints leading away, just rock upon rock. Back at base, we logged everything, tagged the location, and expanded the radius another mile in every direction. The family insisted on helping, but policy kept them near the rim. I remember Sarah walking the overlook alone that evening, her hand resting on the rail, staring down into that endless red silence. She didn't cry. She just stood there as if waiting for the canyon to give her back something it had borrowed. Day 4 brought rain hard, sudden, with thunder rolling down the walls like an avalanche. We had to pull the teams out for safety. The wind tore through the trees near the watchtower, and for hours all we could do was sit under canvas and listen to water hammer the stone. Every drop erased more of the traces we'd found, the prints, the chalk marks, maybe even the faint scent the dogs had caught earlier. You could feel morale dip like the barometer. When the storm finally eased, the canyon smelled raw, clean, and merciless. That night, the Rodriguez family gathered around the heater in the command tent. Sarah asked me what I really thought. I told her the truth as I knew it. Her mother was cautious, her daughter capable. If they were still out there, they'd built shelter, found water. She nodded, folded her hands, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then she thanked me for looking. That small gesture still sits heavy with me. It meant she already understood something the rest of us weren't ready to say aloud. By the end of the week, the search had grown to nearly 200 people. Helicopters crisscrossed the sky, drones scanned the ravines, and dogs combed the upper trails. Every lead brought us back to silence. The canyon swallows evidence like it swallows sound. We kept the perimeter posted, hoping they might emerge somewhere along the eastern ridges, dehydrated but alive. The hope kept us moving long after reason started to fade. Then came the moment that hardened every doubt. On the 8th day, a tracker from one of the volunteer teams radioed in. He'd found a partial footprint, small, newer than the rains, leading toward a narrow gully known for flash floods. When we got there, the print had already half filled with mud, but the tread pattern matched the boots on Emma's gear list. It pointed toward a drop-off too steep for an easy descent. No sign of another print nearby. Maybe she'd tried to scout ahead, or maybe the current had carried her from somewhere else entirely. We mapped it, photographed it, and left markers in place. It was a clue, but not an answer. Days stretched. Search turned to recovery, though no one wanted to say it out loud. Paperwork shifted terminology first. Rescue operations suspended. Limited recovery search to continue. Words that mean the same thing on paper but not in the heart. When we packed up most of the gear 2 weeks later, the canyon felt heavier, like it knew it had outlasted us. For months after, I kept their file on my desk, map photos, my field notes from that first morning. Every so often, someone would stop by the station to ask if there was any new word. I'd tell them no, not yet. Then I'd find myself glancing out the window at the horizon, half expecting to see 2 small figures walking back toward the watchtower, sun at their backs, waving like they'd only been gone a day. But the desert doesn't return what it keeps until it's ready. I'd learned that lesson again 5 years later when a ranger named Sofia Mendez spotted that same faded strip of blue wedged in the rock, the one I still see when I close my eyes. Back then, though, all we had was silence, a family waiting by a phone that refused to ring, and a canyon that stretched farther than any of us could see. After the official search wound down, the canyon went back to pretending nothing had happened. That's the cruel part about places like this. The silence returns too easily. Tourists come back with their cameras, the buses idle at the overlooks, and you start to wonder if what you saw, what you felt, ever really happened at all. But for some of us, it never stopped. For months after the last helicopter left, I'd find myself driving out to the Tanner Trail before dawn, standing at the edge with a cup of cold coffee, staring into the same emptiness where those 2 women had vanished. It wasn't duty anymore. It was habit mixed with something heavier, an unfinished sentence that wouldn't leave me alone. The park never formally closes a case like that. It just gets quieter. We still logged reports of found gear, stray footprints, scraps of fabric that never amounted to anything. Families of the missing call once a week at first, then once a month, then only on anniversaries. Sarah Rodriguez was different. She never stopped calling. Every few weeks she'd check in, calm but firm, asking if there was any new evidence, any small sign we might have missed. Sometimes she'd drive up from Phoenix on weekends, park near the tower, and just sit. She'd bring her mother's hiking journals and maps, open them on the hood of her car, tracing trails with her fingers like she was trying to feel where they'd gone. Winter came early that year. Snow settled on the rim by Thanksgiving, and most of the lower trails iced over. I remember one afternoon walking along the upper watchtower path, my radio barely working in the cold. The canyon looked frozen, solid gray sky, white ledges, nothing moving but the smoke from a far-off fire someone shouldn't have built. I turned back to the ranger truck, telling myself it was over. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't finished. The canyon has a way of keeping things. It keeps bones. Cameras, even memories. It just takes its time returning them. By spring, Sarah had built a website. "Find Margaret and Emma," it said across the top in simple letters. She filled it with photos Margaret on her porch. Emma with her camera slung over her shoulder, both of them framed by sunlight and dust. People shared it all over. Hikers wrote in with theories, some good, some strange. A retired FBI agent named Robert Martinez reached out offering help. Said he'd seen too many cases like this, well-prepared people disappearing in places that shouldn't be able to swallow them whole. I remember meeting him once in the small diner outside Flagstaff. He had that deliberate calm some investigators carry, like they've learned not to make promises. He told me straight, when experienced hikers vanish this completely, it's rarely a single mistake. It's a chain of small things, one bad step, one bad call, or something none of us could predict. That spring, the family organized another search. Smaller, more targeted. They raised money for it online, hired a private SAR team that used drones and ground-penetrating radar. I walked with them for part of it, carrying a radio and trying not to look hopeful. The new tech could see beneath loose rock, even detect small voids where the ground had shifted. We spent a week scanning the same section of canyon, listening to the drone's faint hum echo off the walls. Nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a buckle, not a sign of human life. Afterward, the crew packed up their gear, shook our hands, and promised to stay in touch. But I could see it in their faces. They already knew this one wouldn't give up its story easily. As months turned into years, life found a way of moving around the emptiness. I got promoted to field operations supervisor, the kind of job that fills your days with reports instead of footsteps. But the case never left me. Sometimes new rangers would ask about the file, and I'd tell them, it's not about being lost. It's about not being found. And they'd look at me like I'd said something strange. Maybe I had. Every September, the Rodriguez family came back. They'd hold a small memorial near the tower, leave flowers, speak quietly among themselves. I'd stand back by the trucks out of uniform and let them have their space. On the second anniversary, Sarah handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photo of Margaret taken the week before the trip, standing in front of her apartment with a hiking pole in one hand and a smile that could light a room. She said, "If you ever find anything, I want her to come home with that look on her face. I promised her I'd remember it." By the third year, public attention faded. The news stopped calling. People had new mysteries to follow, new headlines to fill the air. But in the canyon, we still carried it. Every ranger on that shift kept one eye open for an old trail marker, a faint track, something that didn't belong. We found nothing. Nature is thorough. Wind, sun, rain, they all work together out here, wiping away what you hope to keep. One morning in late 2023, a call came from the south sector. A crew doing geological surveys had spotted what looked like an abandoned campsite near one of the smaller drainage canyons. My heart kicked before I even grabbed the keys. When I got there, it was little more than a scatter of fabric and rusted cans old enough to fool you, but not old enough to ignore. We sifted through it carefully, checking serial numbers on gear, looking for initials, but the items didn't match the records. Different brand, different decade. Another false echo. Still, for a few hours, hope had a heartbeat again. By then, I'd learned not to make assumptions. I'd also learned that grief doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from waiting too long for an answer. Sarah said as much the last time we spoke that year. She was tired. Her voice had softened around the edges. "I used to dream of them, she told me, standing somewhere high looking out at the canyon, alive and safe. Now I just hoped they weren't afraid. I didn't know what to say, so I told her the only thing I believed, that the canyon holds its own kind of mercy. It keeps secrets because it knows how fragile we are. Winter came again, colder than usual. Snow reached the lower shelves, turning the red stone into something ghostly and white. I spent Christmas on duty, walking the overlooked trails alone, thinking about Margaret's blue hat and Emma's water bottle, how both had looked so deliberate, as if meant to guide us, but somehow sent us in circles instead. I remember stopping at the exact point where I'd last seen them, imagining their footprints, hearing the faint laughter that had followed our short conversation years before. It was strange how memory can sound louder than wind when you let it. Then came the 5th year. By early September 2024, I'd nearly stopped expecting anything new. 5 years is a long time for silence. Most cases like that you file away under unresolved and learn to move on. But the canyon has its own calendar, and it doesn't care about ours. It was a Thursday when the call came through from one of our junior rangers, a geologist named Sophia Mendez. She'd been mapping erosion patterns on the far side of the formation we call Shiva Temple, a place most folks never reach without ropes. Her voice over the radio was calm, professional, but I caught something underneath something careful. She said she'd spotted an anomaly, her word, a small piece of fabric lodged deep in a sandstone crevice. The color, she said, was faded blue. I felt my throat go dry. I asked her to mark the coordinates and stay put. Within an hour, we had a full technical rescue crew and route climbers with proper gear cameras, medics standing by. I drove out ahead of them, heart hammering the whole way, and when I reached the overlook closest to her position, the sky was turning that bright, merciless gold you get before noon. Sophia met me at the rim, pointing toward a narrow cut below us. She showed me the zoomed-in photo on her tablet. There it was, clear as day, a scrap of fabric wedged in the rock, stubborn against the wind. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I watched as the climbers began their descent, inching down the wall with ropes squealing softly through their harnesses. The radio crackled every few seconds with updates, depth rock condition visibility. Then one of them called up, "We've got an opening down here. Looks like a small cave extends deeper than expected." My pulse spiked. They went quiet for a minute, just the sound of rope sliding boots, scraping stone. Then a voice came through, slower, heavier. "You need to see this." From where I stood, I couldn't see inside, just the mouth of the cave, half hidden by shadow. The lead climber's flashlight flickered against the wall, then disappeared into darkness. What came next felt impossible. Another voice broke over the radio, urgent, trembling. "We've got movement. 2 people. Alive." For a second I thought I'd misheard. The entire ridge fell silent except for the wind. Then Sophia looked at me, eyes wide, hand over her mouth. I grabbed the radio, demanded confirmation, and the reply came back clear as the sky above us. 2 adult females. Weak, but responsive. 5 years. 5 years of silence, of maps, of empty air, and now 2 voices echoing up from a hole in the earth. I could barely breathe. I watched the rescue unfold, the medics lowering stretchers, the climbers guiding fragile bodies up one slow foot at a time. And when the first stretcher broke into the sunlight, I recognized the gray hair, the weathered skin, the unmistakable curve of a face I'd seen smiling over a trail map all those years ago. Margaret Chen alive. Behind her, younger, thinner eyes, blinking against the light, Emma. Even now I can still hear the radio static, the disbelieving cheers from the crew, the way Sophia whispered, "My God, they made it." I stood there, unable to move, the wind pulling at my sleeves. The canyon around us suddenly too vast to understand. For 5 years I'd thought of this place as a grave. That day it turned into something else entirely. A reminder that even here where silence rules and time erases everything, sometimes the story isn't over. When they lifted both women onto the helicopter and the rotors began to turn, I stepped back. Dust whipping around my boots, the sky blindingly blue. I didn't wave. I just watched until the sound faded, replaced again by the canyon's quiet breath. It would take days before we learned how they'd survived, weeks before the world caught up to the miracle of it. But right then, all I could think about was the promise I'd made to Sarah that if I ever found them, her mother would come home with that same look on her face. And as the helicopter disappeared into the horizon, I knew she would. The sound of the helicopter faded until all that was left was the wind working its way through the junipers. For a long time, nobody spoke. We just stood there, squinting into the empty sky, trying to believe what we'd just seen. Two names that had become part of every morning briefing, every logbook, every late-night conversation over cold coffee. Suddenly, they weren't missing anymore. They were alive. I remember feeling the tremor in my hands when I keyed the mic and told command they were inbound to Flagstaff. The radio crackled with half-laughed curses, tears disbelief. After 5 years of silence, that one message cut through like sunlight after a storm. By the time I reached the hospital, the parking lot was jammed with news vans and people holding cameras high over their heads. Flashbulbs popped even though it was broad daylight. Inside the air was different sterile humming full of quiet urgency. I flashed my ID to a nurse at the door and she waved me through. Down the hall, the first thing I saw was Emma sitting up in a hospital bed, hair-matted face, drawn, eyes sunburned but alive. Her hand was resting on her grandmother's blanket, not holding it, just touching it as if to make sure she was real. Margaret looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, but her eyes were open clear, and when she saw me, she smiled like someone recognizing an old trail marker. The doctors worked in near silence, their movements rehearsed. You could tell they knew this wasn't a normal intake. These two had lived in the dark while the rest of us lived in questions. I stood at the foot of the bed as they checked vitals. Took blood-whispered numbers that sounded more like coordinates than medical readings. When the doctor asked if Margaret remembered anything about the fall, she nodded faintly and said, "A picture. I was trying to take a picture." That was all she could manage before exhaustion took her under again. I stepped out into the hallway where Sarah stood with her back against the wall, arms folded like she was bracing herself against a wave. She didn't see me at first. Then she looked up, eyes wet but steady, and whispered, "You kept your promise." I started to tell her it wasn't me, that it was the team, the Rangers, the luck of one sharp-eyed geologist, but she shook her head before I could finish. "No," she said. "You never stopped looking." That night, after the crowd had thinned and the corridors fell quiet, I sat in my truck outside the hospital watching the windows glow. I thought about that blue fabric Sophia had seen in the rock, how it had been there the whole time, invisible from every angle but one. It struck me that survival in its strangest form might look like that too. Hidden until the world happens to turn just right. The next morning, the doctors cleared me to sit in on the debriefing with investigators. Margaret and Emma were both awake, lucid, and ready to talk, though their voices were soft like wind through dry grass. Emma spoke first. She explained that the first day of their trip had gone just as planned until her grandmother slipped trying to photograph a patch of desert wildflowers. The fall had been bad compound fracture deep cut too far from the main trail to call for help. Emma said she remembered the sound of the canyon closing and the way every echo felt heavier than the one before it. She had tried to send a signal from the satellite device, but it must have been blocked by the walls around them. When the battery failed, she made a decision to stay with her grandmother and find a place they could both survive. As she talked, I could see the doctor's pen slow down. None of us could quite picture it yet. Two people vanishing, not through chance, but by choice survival as a kind of duty. Emma described building a makeshift stretcher, dragging her grandmother inch by inch toward a cave she'd found earlier while exploring for photographs. It wasn't much she said, but it was dry, narrow, and deep enough to keep them hidden from storms. She'd figured they could wait there for a day or two, maybe 3, until rescue came. But rescue never came. For 5 years, that cave became their world. The investigators let her speak at her own pace, and what she told us didn't sound like confession or performance. It sounded like memory. She said they lived on what they could gather: insects, edible plants, bits of moss that collected dew. There was a spring trickling deep inside the rock that kept them alive through the summers. She used scraps of metal from their gear to build tools, fashioned lamps out of melted wax and string. When winter came, they rationed food so tightly she could recite every calorie by memory. There were days, she said, when the wind outside howled so loud they thought it was people calling their names. But it was just the canyon talking back. Margaret, listening from her bed, added details when her strength allowed how Emma had kept her mind sharp by reciting bird species, by teaching her to identify rock layers by color, by talking about every person she'd ever loved. She wouldn't let me stop thinking, Margaret said. Said if we stopped talking, we'd stop being. I looked over at Sarah, then her hand covering her mouth, her shoulders shaking not from sorrow this time, but something deeper. Relief mixed with awe. The medical reports came back over the next few days. Severe malnutrition healed fractures, vitamin deficiencies. But the doctors said something I'll never forget. They were amazed at how strong both women's hearts still were. One cardiologist told me quietly, "It's like their bodies refuse to quit even when everything else should have." Outside the hospital, reporters filled every inch of sidewalk, cameras pressed against glass doors, microphones shoved into the air. Everyone wanted the same answer. How could they have survived? But survival isn't a headline. It's a long list of small decisions, and those don't fit into sound bites. The Park Service released a statement about the recovery, and the hospital held a short press briefing. That was enough from the public, but for those of us who'd walked those trails, it raised even more questions. How had we missed them that close to our search grids? How could they have stayed hidden in a place we thought we knew so well? A few days later, Sophia Mendez, the ranger who found the fabric, visited the hospital. She stood by the bed looking almost shy. Margaret reached for her hand and whispered, "You saw what no one else could." Sophia just nodded, tears catching the corners of her eyes. "No," she said softly. "I just happened to be standing in the right place." Back at the park, we began reviewing everything: the search maps, drone footage, thermal scans. The cave had been checked before, but from every visible angle it appeared sealed. The crevice where Sophia found the fabric had disguised the entrance like a trick of light. Even now, knowing exactly where it was, you'd have to crawl to see it. The truth was humbling. The canyon hadn't given them up sooner because we hadn't looked at it the right way. In the weeks that followed, recovery turned to reflection. The FBI park investigators and medical teams spent hours interviewing both women, piecing together the timeline of their survival. Emma's notes scratched on rocks carved on the cave wall were documented as evidence of their endurance. Some called it a miracle. Others said it was pure skill. I thought it was both. By the third week, Margaret's strength had returned enough for her to be moved to a rehabilitation wing. She was in a wheelchair now, but her mind was sharp as ever. She asked about the canyon, about whether the fall flowers had bloomed that year. When I told her yes, she smiled faintly and said, "Then it's still beautiful." Emma, on the other hand, struggled more with re-entering the world. She startled easily at loud noises, preferred dim rooms, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. The doctors said her body would heal faster than her mind. I believed them. One evening, Sarah asked if I'd like to join them for dinner in the hospital cafeteria. Nothing fancy, just takeout and paper cups of coffee. We sat there for a while, no one saying much, just listening to the hum of vending machines. Emma finally broke the silence. "When you're out there that long," she said, "you start to forget how many days have passed. The sun rises, the moon comes, and you stop counting. But there was one sound that always told me it wasn't over the river. You can't hear it from inside the cave, but if you crawl to the edge and wait for the wind to shift, you can catch it. Just a faint roar way below. I'd listen to that and think, Life's still moving somewhere. Her words stayed with me. Long after they were discharged, long after the reporters packed up and left, that image, the two of them in that cave, listening to the river, played over and over in my mind. It reminded me of something Margaret had said years before the morning they vanished. She told me the canyon kept its secrets, but sometimes if you were patient and respectful, it shared them. Maybe this was one of those times. Before I left that night, I walked past their room one last time. Emma was asleep, her breathing steady. Margaret was awake, eyes open, looking out the window at the dark sky over Flagstaff. She caught my reflection in the glass and said quietly, "Ranger Morrison, thank you for not letting us disappear." I didn't have an answer for that. I just nodded and stepped back into the hallway. Outside, the desert wind was still moving through the trees, soft and restless. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the canyon waited silent as ever. I knew I'd go back soon, maybe just to stand where we'd found that scrap of fabric. There were questions still hanging in the air, things the investigators hadn't yet made sense of. But that could wait. For now, what mattered was that the canyon had finally spoken and two voices had answered back. For weeks after their rescue, the hospital in Flagstaff became the center of our world. Reporters camped outside day and night. Strangers sent letters and blankets and prayers. And through it all, those two women quietly rebuilt what 5 years in the dark had taken from them. I saw them every few days, Margaret sitting near the window asking about the sunrise times at the canyon, and Emma walking the halls a little farther each morning, her steps slow but steady. The noise outside never reached them. Inside, their recovery felt almost sacred, like the world had gone still to let them catch their breath. I remember one morning I brought them a small desert rock I'd picked up near the site of their rescue. Margaret ran her fingers over the surface and smiled. "The canyon's still teaching me things," she said. "You can live a whole lifetime in 1 mile of stone." I didn't know what to say to that. She had earned the right to understand that place in a way none of us ever would. When they were strong enough to leave, we arranged for a quiet transfer to a rehabilitation center up north. No cameras, no speeches, just a small convoy of park vehicles and family cars moving under a bright October sky. Before she got into the van, Emma turned to me and said, "I'm not ready to see the canyon again, but one day I will." I told her that whenever she was ready, it would still be there waiting in its own silence. Back at the park, life returned to its rhythm, though it felt different somehow. The trails filled again, the watchtower reopened, but there was a kind of reverence in the air, a sense that what had happened had left a mark you couldn't see on any map. We held a quiet ceremony at Desert View, not a celebration, more like a moment of thanks. The Rodriguez family stood together near the overlook, the wind pushing through their hair. Sarah spoke briefly, her voice calm and certain. She thanked the rangers, the volunteers, the people who had refused to let the names fade. Then she placed a small brass plaque at the base of a juniper tree overlooking the canyon. It read simply, "For the ones who waited, and for those who never stopped listening." The cave where Margaret and Emma survived was mapped and documented but left untouched. The Park Service decided not to make it a tourist site. Some places don't need to be visited again. It's enough to know they exist. A few months later, the park installed a new program for hikers, free locator beacons, and mandatory training for anyone heading into the deeper trails. They named it the Echo Initiative. It was Emma's idea. She said if people understood how quickly isolation could turn into danger, maybe fewer names would end up etched on brass. I was asked to help lead the first group session. Standing in front of 20 hikers with bright new gear and wide eyes, I told them about light, how it bends inside the canyon, how even at noon you can lose your bearings in the shadows. I didn't tell them everything, not the parts that still lived in the quiet between my ribs. But I told them enough. When I finished, a man in the back raised his hand and said, "So after all that, do you still trust the canyon?" I thought for a moment before answering. "Yes," I said. I just trust it differently now. The following spring, the story of Margaret and Emma made its way across the country. It wasn't framed as a mystery anymore. It was a story about endurance, about the human will to survive, where everything says you shouldn't. Documentaries called it miraculous. The papers called it the Canyon Miracle. But around here, we called it something simpler. We called it proof that sometimes hope outlasts reason. Every now and then, a tourist recognizes me from one of those interviews. They'll ask what it was like, how we found them, what they said when they came out of the dark. I always tell them the same thing. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for applause. The kind that belongs to people who've seen too much and still chose to keep living. About 6 months after the rescue, I got a postcard in the mail. It was from Emma. No return address, just a photograph of the Colorado River at dusk. On the back, she'd written, "We're learning how to live in the open again. Thank you for giving us back the sky." I keep it pinned to the inside of my locker at the station. It reminds me that sometimes our work isn't about finding the lost, it's about giving them a way home when they're ready. Margaret passed away quietly 2 years later, surrounded by her daughter and granddaughter. She'd told them she wanted her ashes scattered at dawn over the canyon rim near the trail where her last photograph was taken. Emma carried out that wish herself, hiking the short path with a ranger escort, stopping every few feet to catch her breath. When she reached the edge, she opened the small urn and the wind did the rest. From a distance, it looked like the canyon was breathing her back in. After that, Emma stayed in Flagstaff for a while. She began volunteering with search and rescue teams, teaching wilderness safety to new hikers, explaining how panic works, how silence can trick you. When people asked why she would go back to the place that nearly took her life, she'd smile faintly and say, "Because it gave me back who I am." I've seen her a few times, since once at the annual safety seminar once by chance in town. She always waves, always asks how the canyon's doing, like it's an old friend we both share but rarely visit. As for me, I still work the rim. Some mornings when the sky is clear and the light hits just right, I walk down to that same overlook where it all began. There's a small metal tag on the railing now engraved with coordinates and the year. It's subtle, most people never notice it, but every ranger knows what it marks. I stand there listening to the wind push through the stone, and I think about everything this place has taken and everything it's given back. Time moves differently out here. 5 years, 10 years, they don't mean much to the canyon. But for the people who wait, every minute is a lifetime. I've seen what silence can do, and I've seen how a single sound, a voice, a radio call, a heartbeat can break it open again. That's the part no one teaches you about search and rescue. You're not just looking for people, you're looking for proof that they're still part of this world. Every year on the anniversary of their rescue, we gather at the Overlook. Just a few of us, the original team, a couple of new rangers, sometimes Sarah or Emma, if they can make it. We don't make speeches. We just stand together for a minute looking out over that endless stretch of red stone and shadow. Someone always leaves a wildflower at the base of the plaque. Then we go back to work because that's what you do after something like this. You keep showing up. You keep listening. The last time I was there, the sun was low, the sky the color of rust, and the wind carried a sound I couldn't place, soft like a whisper. Maybe it was the canyon breathing. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was nothing at all. But it felt like a thank you. Not loud, not clear, just there. When people ask why I still tell this story after all these years, I tell them it's not about the mystery or the miracle. It's about what remains when both are gone. It's about a family who never stopped waiting, a ranger who never stopped looking, and a place that reminded us all that silence isn't the end. It's just the space before someone answers back. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.